Let's go ahead. So we are recording. Where am I? Okay. Yeah, so we've been talking about the Olivet Discourse, and it kind of one thing had sort of led to another. But today I thought I'd do something just on the Abomination of Desolation. For a lot of you guys, I'm sure a picture like this would throw you off, because when people talk about the Abomination of Desolation, usually what they have in mind is a future Antichrist scenario, because they read that in Daniel 9 and in the other passages. And so, but really, when just to kind of refresh our memories and just to see where we're at, in Matthew 24 and in Mark 13 and also in Luke 21, Jesus mentions the temple that they've just come from, and he tells his disciples, actually there's four of them that he talks to privately, and he says, you know, all these things that you see, the temple complex and all those fancy buildings that you're oohing and eyeing about, he's like, not one of the stones going to be left on another. So they ask him, well, when's this going to be, and what's going to be the signs of these things? And then he goes and ahead and tells them, and we have what we call the Olivet Discourse. Now, what some people do with the Olivet Discourse is they automatically make it all about stuff that's in the future. The awkward thing about that is that then Jesus brought up something, and when asked about it, that he totally changed the subject on them. So there has to be at least a portion in the Olivet Discourse that where Jesus is actually addressing the question, not just because they asked the question, but because he was the one who brought it up in the first place. And if you talk about, you know, this war that happened in the year 70 AD, a lot of people know kind of about it, but it was the marker of when the old covenant finally, there was a finality to it. It brought a real closure to anything having to do with the old covenant. The covenant was given at Mount Sinai, and it went on until the Babylonian captivity, and it was put on hiatus for 70 years. But when they came back, they reinstituted, you know, the practices that were in the temple, and that continued for 490 more years. But Jesus predicted that it would basically come to an end, and it should come to an end, because the new covenant in Christ was there in person. And the covenant that Jesus paid for on the cross was not going to be accepted by most Jews, I would say, but there wasn't a remnant, and of course he built his church on that remnant of the people who recognized who their Messiah was, and that's why we have a new covenant. But the entire New Testament was written in between that time when Jesus had already gone to be seated at the right hand of the Father, and the time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And when you read you read little bits and pieces, especially in the book of Hebrews, about how that covenant is about to come to an end, how all of those sacrifices are going to come to an end because of what Christ has done. It would not continue. So even if today, you know, in the modern state of Israel or something like that, which isn't really, in my opinion, the same thing as Israel of the Bible, we're of the same, we're part of that same tree. We're grafted into the same tree that it existed all the way back to Abraham. But even if there was another temple built, there's not going to be another we're not going back to the first covenant because Jesus paid the sacrifice, and there's no need for sacrifices. It could be for show, it could be for culture, it could be for other things, but God's not going to dwell a physical temple anymore because he's made his temple out of living stones, which is us, and it's being built as we speak. So the significance of AD 7 is AD 70 or 70 AD, and the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem is of utmost importance. So let's talk about the word abomination, because in general, if you're talking about worshiping a false god or a person or something within sacred space, doesn't necessarily have to be the Holy of Holies, doesn't even have to be the temple, but some place that is sacred, even if it's Jerusalem, the holy city, or its surroundings. Worshiping false gods in any of that sacred space is what would be considered an abomination. So some examples of this is when you go to 1 Kings 11:7, it says, "Then Solomon built a high place for Shamash, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods." So these are abominations that are on nearby hills that he built. In Ezekiel 5:11, it says, "Therefore, as I live, says the Lord God, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things and with all your abominations, therefore I will also diminish you. My eye will not spare, nor will I have any pity." So how's the word desolation being used throughout scripture? It says here in Isaiah 64, and Isaiah 64 is talking about the first desolation of the temple in Jerusalem, which is by the Babylonians. It says, "Your holy cities are a wilderness. Zion is a wilderness, Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy and beautiful temple, where your fathers praised you, is burned with fire." In Matthew 23, right before all of the discourse, Jesus says to Jerusalem, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate." So he's warning that that temple, because he's saying this in the temple and around the temple in Jerusalem, he's saying your house, that means the temple basically, is left to you desolate. In other words, it's going to be desolated. And what he's warning them is, of course, the destruction by the Romans in AD 70. So we have three desolations of the temple and in Jerusalem. The first one was by Nebuchadnezzar. When you read Daniel, of course, he's a Babylonian exile. Ezekiel's a Babylonian exile. Isaiah warns about it. There's a whole bunch in the prophets that warn about the coming exile of Jerusalem. But it was by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. And that's, of course, the Babylonian Empire. And the reason it came was due to the persistent idolatry and breaking of God's covenant and the corruption of their leadership. It lasted for 70 years. So for 70 years, there was no practice of the old covenant. The second one was by Antiochus Epiphanes, which was in the Greek era. It led to the Maccabean revolt, and it was in 167 BC. So only 167 years before Christ. That was due to the adoption of Hellenism. In other words, it was a judgment by God. It was perceived that way. What they wanted was to adopt more of the Greek way of life, and including their gods. They built a gymnasium, which was actually more like a pagan worship practice. And
Like, was that built like at the temple?
That was built in Jerusalem, and there were other things that the priests. One of the priests had kind of usurped the throne from his brother, and then he made a deal with the Greek authorities, and they wanted more. They kind of wanted citizenship. So part of the Jerusalem was, no, we need to stay independent from Hellenization. And others were like, well, no, we look at like how good Hellenization is and look at the things that we could benefit from it. And so they pushed for that, and that included some corrupt people in the priesthood. So corrupt leadership. Now it lasted 2,300 evenings and mornings. You have a recording about that in Daniel. In fact, I should say a recording, but it was a recording ahead of the time because it's really prophecy. He says that for 2,300 evenings and mornings that there would be that there was going to be a desolation there. We'll actually read that verse. So that was the second desolation. So it didn't last that long because there was a revolt and a rededication of the temple. And Jesus is recorded as going to Jerusalem and participating in the Feast of Rededication, which is now connected to what we know as Hanukkah.
But the second one, it wasn't destroyed.
No, it wasn't burnt to the ground. No, it wasn't. It was yeah, it was a desolation. More really what happened was that Antiochus Epiphanes came in. He slaughtered a pig and he set up an altar to Zeus. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes, which means, he thought he was some kind of a god. Even the idol to Zeus looked like him. So there's all these kind of like abominations that were going on. And he killed a whole bunch of priests and crucified a bunch of people, did all kinds of stuff, But the revolt was successful, and so it only lasted 2,300 days, roughly. It is still a long time, yeah. And then finally, the final desolation of the temple in Jerusalem was by Romans under Titus. And of course, again, it was due to their rejection of their Messiah. This time it was, their Messiah shows up in Jerusalem and he says, "Woe to you, Jerusalem, and how often I would have gathered you like a hen gathers her chicks. But now you did not recognize the time of your visitation, and your house is going to be left to you desolate." This is actually, again, a judgment by God, and because of, again, the corruption of their leadership. And we saw that over and over and over again, he was laying into the scribes and Pharisees and elders and and everybody who ran the Jerusalem system and saying, "You're corrupt, you're corrupt, you're corrupt." So, so that was the final removal of the old covenant. The old covenant was done. Priesthood is gone. The Sadducees were the ones who controlled the high priesthood. There are no more Sadducees. They all went. The temple went, etc. But of course, the new temple, who is started being built, and that's us. So in Matthew 24, where I'm citing from, it says in verse 15, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." So Daniel, who Jesus is citing here, he wrote during the first desolation, which was in Babylon. The dream that he interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2, and the visions that he predicted, the two other desolations that were to come in Israel's future. So Daniel foresees the desolation caused by Antiochus Epiphanes in 167. And he also foresees the desolation of Jerusalem by Romans in AD 70. Daniel also predicted the coming of Christ in his kingdom. So it's all there. So just to kind of like give you a refresher on what I'm talking about in Daniel, this is the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in his dreams. It had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver. It had a belly and thighs of bronze, and then finally the legs and feet and toes of iron. And then he sees a rock not made by human hands, smashing the base of the statue, and the whole thing came crumbling down. We can connect those things with things that Jesus said. He says, "On this rock I will build my church," and we see that he becomes the chief cornerstone, and that we are being made of, that God is building his temple made of not by human hands, and that we're part of that structure. But in that prophecy, he sees that this rock grows and grows and grows and becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. And so it's about how the kingdom of Christ is going to span the globe, how it's going to become the thing, the big kingdom around the world. We understand now that it's a spiritual kingdom. Jesus said it's not a kingdom that you can say, here it is or there it is, and point to it, but he says the kingdom is right among you, and it's that it's a kingdom not of this world. He said, in the days of these kings, God will set up his kingdom, which we understand to be the church. So Daniel 7 is actually not a dream by Nebuchadnezzar, but a vision by Daniel himself, and it echoes the same parts that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. So the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire itself. Daniel saw that vision as a lion with wings, which if you look at Babylonian, statues of the Escalapus and that sort of thing. What is it again?
Lhasa statues.
Lhasa, yeah, it was like a lion with wings. Medo-Persia, which was the chest and arms of silver, is the same. Daniel sees it as a bear with these ribs in its mouth, and one side becomes much stronger, which is Persia becomes much stronger. Then you have the Greek Empire, which is you end up with 4 heads. And then finally Rome, which is this beast that he couldn't describe, that was much different from the other ones. So they parallel the same structure. Now, whereas Nebuchadnezzar saw it as a glorious statue, of course, Daniel, the way it's presented to him is that these are actually beasts. These are less than human, and they're not of God, So in Daniel 8, you have another prophecy, and it deals with just 2 kingdoms. It kind of deals only with the Medo-Persian going into the Greek era. And what you have is that Medo-Persia is here represented by a ram, and that this goat with a single horn, that horn is Alexander the Great, and he but that horn is broken off, and in place of that one horn, you have 4 kingdoms that show up on that goat, and one of these, the Seleucids, is where Antiochus Epiphanes would eventually come from, and bring the second abomination that causes desolation to Israel, right? So Antiochus Epiphanes, his name meant the God made manifest, and of course he had done all this destruction. I won't go back into all of that, but of course Judas Maccabeus led a revolt, and he won this great battle at the Emmaus. Does Emmaus ring a bell?
Like a name of the city?
Yeah, Emmaus. So you remember when Jesus was walking with his disciples after he was he'd been resurrected? They didn't recognize him, and they're walking on the road to Emmaus. Yeah, it's the Emmaus road. If you hear like Jewish people walking to Emmaus, it'd be kind of like saying some Americans walking to Gettysburg. I mean, it's lit up with meaning because of a significant battle there, so that's kind of like what they end up doing, is that he tells them, like he shows them how all this Old Testament stuff is about himself, and then they turn around and they go to Jerusalem, so they end up not going to Emmaus. But that's how to remember like where that battle was won.
Practicing Hanukkah then?
No, Hanukkah came from this event.
Oh,
yeah. So Hanukkah is kind of like the celebration because when they rededicated the temple, there's kind of a legend that they were going to run out of the oil, but it miraculously stayed lit. And
I always thought that was in the Nehemiah time, or no, in Maccabean time, yeah.
so it's between the testaments.
Okay,
So
yeah.
it's after Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther and all that. So what they call the silent years, but there's a lot of stuff that happened in the silent years, that 400 years between then. So it's in the Greek when Israel is dominated by the Greeks. Here in Daniel 8:3, it says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another one holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary, and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." So this is what Judas Maccabeus ended up doing. The 2,300 evenings and mornings, some people see it as 2,300 days, which would mark the time from when Antiochus Epiphanes first marched into Jerusalem to let me see, the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled. And so that could have been the transgression that makes desolate. The other way to look at it was be that, like, you have evening and morning sacrifices. So between those two sacrifices, then you have 1,500 days, but it still works out because that is the time from what was the event again? From when he first attacked, I think it was. Yeah, there's two events there. One of them was 2,300 days before, and the other one was 1,500 days before. So either way you look at it, it's a remarkable prophecy here that became fulfilled. Daniel 11 is also about the buildup to Antiochus Epiphanes. You have all these stories about the kings of the north and the south, so you have that desolate language there. It says, "Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortresses, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate." And then the final day place where you have in Daniel where it says desolate is in 12:11. It says, "And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days." I think this has something to do with 70 AD, but it's really difficult to decipher Daniel 12. At least for me it is. Yeah, I found something that I think could be this today, but I'm not sure. I don't want to say anything about it. So here's where we're going to get into the 70 weeks of Daniel. And so it's going to go into the Roman era. So if you look at the 70 weeks of Daniel, it brings you from this command to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. This was by Cyrus. The Bible names Cyrus by name before he's even born. And he shows up and makes this decree to rebuild the Jerusalem. And that there's going to be a week. These are weeks of years. Remember, these are not like 7-day weeks. These are actually just called sevens in Hebrew. And so we call them weeks. It's really better to call them sevens. So it's going to be 7 sevens. And then there's going to be 67 sevens, which make up 69. And then you have the final 7 here during Christ's ministry. And yeah, it did mean completion. So I think there's a degree of symbolism in there, but no matter how you cut it. Now, I'm not going to get into the dating today. There is because it's a little complex, but I don't want to bog us down with that today. "And on the wings of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator." So here in at the end of the the 70 weeks of Daniel, that's where it also talks about the desolator and the making of desolate. And that has to do with the year 8070. So Daniel 9 to 70 weeks, it says here, so I'm going to read the 70 weeks vision, okay? 70, and now to kind of give you a background of what's going on here is that Daniel has been praying. He knows that 70 years of exile is about to be over, and he expects that that there's going to be a decree to go back and restore the temple and restore Jerusalem. And he fasts about it, and he's praying about it, and he gets a message. And kind of what's being said here is that, like, yeah, 70 years are up, but there is 490 years that are going to be difficult, and they're decreed for your people. After that, things are going to be wrapped up. And it doesn't tell you exactly how that's going to be, but it makes sense in retrospect. And so it's kind of like, yeah, you're still kind of going to be in exile still, and things are going to be difficult. And at the end of this 490 years, you're going to have another desolation of the temple. So it says 70 weeks of years are determined for your people in your holy city, to one, finish the transgression, to make an end to sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Some will say, translations will say the most holy place. Others will say the most holy one, because we're talking about the later on in the prophecy, you find out about the anointed one, right? So if you're talking about the anointed one, you would be talking about the Messiah, right? And so the Messiah, who's Christ, he did finish the transgression. I mean, transgression is finished because of he paid for our sins. He made an end to sins, and he made reconciliation for iniquity, and he brought in an everlasting righteousness. I mean, this is things that we're comfortable talking about. So, these are things that are going to be resolved at the end of this. He says, therefore, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, which is Cyrus' decree, until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. So if you read Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll hear about a lot of these troubles. Plus, you got to remember Esther's during that time too. And in fact, in Esther's time, the entire Jewish population and the entire empire was going to be wiped out. Like in a day. So
the kingdom of Israel was up in Assyria, though, right?
It wasn't a kingdom at that point. They never had a kingdom after once the Babylonian exile happened. There was never a kingdom.
Yeah, the northern kingdom has been long gone.
Yeah, the northern kingdom had been taken off into exile like 150 years or something before.
Right?
Previous, yeah. So we're talking about the return from Babylon, but actually it's the return from Persia, because the Persians defeated the Babylonians and then inherited everything from them. So that's why Esther is in the Persian king's court, but that was going to be a time where Jerusalem, because in Esther, it actually mentions the unwalled villages. The unwalled villages is something that you see mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah, and in the post-exilic prophets like Zechariah. They didn't have walls, and so in Esther it mentions that they went after the unwalled villages. So in other words, Jerusalem was being attacked. And to give you an idea of the scope of that war, 75,000 people were killed in a day of the enemy. Yeah, the Jews, in probably mostly in Jerusalem, ended up being extremely victorious and killed 75,000 of their enemies. So it was a massive battle just in one day. I mean, in the ancient world, that's huge. Yeah. So, and after the 62 weeks, so we're in week after, this is actually with the 62 and the 7 together. So it's after the 69 weeks. The Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. So he gets cut off within that 70th week. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with, now it says the prince who is to come. So he's talking about Titus here. He'll come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end of it shall be with the flood. Until the end, until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he, who is the Messiah, will confirm a covenant, the promised new covenant with the many for 1 week. Now, a lot of times this gets interpreted as like he, as in Antichrist or something. First of all, Daniel never, there's only 2 books in the Bible that even mention Antichrist, which is in John 1 and in John 2. So yeah, people say, well, there's dozens of names for the Antichrist. I think people have dozens of like different names that they attach to the same future person. But it's not like, this is not about like future Antichrist. So first of all, well, let me read this verse first. Then he, who is the Messiah, will confirm a covenant, the promised new covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. In other words, by becoming it himself, Jesus brings an end to offering or legitimate offering and sacrifice by becoming the sacrifice himself. And on the wing of abomination shall be the one who makes desolate, who we're talking about is Titus, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now, a couple things I need to address here, because if you go to different versions, this is from the New King James. King James has something very similar. There are other things that where it makes it sound, it gets kind of confusing. But part of it is because some of the translators were dispensationalists, and they read certain things into the text and then wrote those in for clarification from their point of view, but it's better to leave it alone. Now, the reason, and I've seen like a lot lengthy arguments about it by Hebrew scholars, or explanations, I should say, where when you're talking about the he, it's about the last subject that's spoken of, which is the Messiah. It's not the subject of this sentence is the people of the prince who is to come. So it's not about this prince, it's about the Messiah. The other thing that I need to point out is that these two, if you've read Psalms, you're probably and Proverbs, you've probably seen a lot of parallel phrases, right? Where you have one thing that's being said, and then the next phrase is the same kind of thing being said, but in parallel. You know what I'm saying? You know, like I'm making it up, okay? It says, you know, those who fear the Lord will prosper. Israel will do good in its days. You know what I mean? So it's like those who fear the Lord is Israel. They will prosper. They'll do good in their days. So there's like parallel phrases. This is all over scripture. So like this right here is a parallel phrase. So it's talking about the Messiah being cut off, and then it's about the one who causes desolation. Then you have the next verse, which is about Messiah, and then you have the rest of it, which is about the abomination that causes desolation under Titus, and that's great. So making a covenant strong, because what you see here is he will confirm a covenant. Messiah will confirm a covenant, and Barnes does a pretty good job. But he says, he shall confirm the covenant. Literally, he shall make strong. The idea is that by giving strength or stability, of making firm and sure. The Hebrew word here evidently refers to the covenant which God is said to establish with his people. Not the covenant, meaning that he would confirm or establish a covenant with the many. According to this, it is not necessary to suppose that it was any existing covenant that is being referred to, but that he would ratify what was understood by the word covenant. That is, that he would lead many to enter into a true and real covenant with God. The meaning of the expression here cannot be mistaken, that during the time specified, he would for 1 week pursue such a course as would tend to establish the true religion, to render it more stable and firm, to give it higher sanctions in the approbation of the many, and to bring it to bear more decidedly and powerfully on the heart. So, sorry, this guy's, well, yeah, he's also writing in the 1800s. So he's
when they used to be smarter than us.
Yeah, exactly. So so what he's saying is that to confirm the covenant means that he's going to, well, think of what Jesus did. People knew that the new covenant was coming. Jesus spent his ministry affirming his covenant. And so then the question is, well, that was for 3.5 years. What about 3.5 years after that?
Can I ask a question about the covenant?
Yeah.
When you say that the people knew a new covenant was coming, I knew that they thought a Messiah was coming that was going to rescue them from their oppressors. But isn't kind of why Jesus took a lot of them by like, a lot of them weren't ready for him because they thought of it just as like a warrior leader, and they weren't expecting the new covenant.
Well, they knew about a new covenant based on, and I shall make a new covenant with them where I will write my laws on their hearts, and so there was the prophets had fully spoken about a new covenant that was coming for Israel eventually. So they knew about that. Now, if they put together that this would come during the time of the Messiah, and whether he would be a military leader and those kinds of things, those are the things that were sort of throwing him off. But there was the remnant, of course, that understood that the new covenant is here. So, and Jesus presented himself as the new covenant the entire time. So Jesus confirmed that he was the new covenant. The new covenant was being made under him, and that he would be doing the things that would now what he did, of course, is that he died on the cross for that. So here's kind of like where we look at that 70th week, which is right here with the cross in the middle. So you're going, well, how does he confirm a covenant for 3.5 years later after that? In the beginning of Acts, it says, the way that Luke is writing to Theophilus is he's saying, that he's writing about what Jesus had and was continuing to do, or something to that effect. So the first 3.5 years after Christ's ascension was still geared towards the Jewish people. In other words, remember here at first, of course, that the Jews, Jesus said that he came only for the lost sheep of Israel. He stayed true to that for his entire ministry. And afterwards, even after the 2nd chapter of Acts, it only went out to Jews. What the early church was doing was targeting the lost sheep of Israel. They were saying, our new covenant is here. This is what we've been talking about the whole time. It wasn't until the stoning of Stephen that you really see the Gentiles coming in.
What about like the woman at the well?
Well, that was an exception to it. Yeah.
Well, Samaritans were like half Jewish anyways, kind of. Right?
Yeah. He was giving hints that this was going to go, and there was a Roman soldier, and there were, but the focus of his ministry was to the lost sheep of Israel, and it remained it remained the focus even for 3.5 years after his resurrection. In other words, it was being presented to Israel first that this your Messiah has come, and this is what has happened. This is the good news, and this means that salvation has come to Israel. That's why when the Gentiles started receiving the Holy Spirit, everybody was surprised. And they just didn't even know, well, what do we do with this? Do we make them Jews first? The Pharisees, who were Christian, wanted to make them, circumcised and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was like for that 7-year period with him being cut off in the middle of it, he that's the way this is typically understood, at least from a preterist point of view. Now, this is kind of like what most of us have grown up with, whereas which is the dispensational view introduced in the 1830s. And that is where you have a cutoff here from, with that prophecy, where the feet end up, like thousands of years later, and it's a restored empire. And it says here, a time gap not revealed in the Old Testament. Well, yeah, it is not revealed in the Old Testament, which is why I don't buy it, so there's nothing in Daniel 9 that says, oh, there's going to be a gap in between, right? Which is why I don't bother putting a gap in there. And then they said the idea was that the church age was an interjection, which is called the great parenthesis, between the cross and when the rapture would happen. And then all of these prophecies would continue with the 70th week. That's why people talk about the 70th week of Daniel as being something in the future. I don't agree with that point of view, and nobody had that point of view until the 19th century. You can look, everybody that I looked at for Daniel 9, when it talks about, or even when it talks about the abomination causes desolation, they're talking about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So I'm kind of back there. So let's talk about what the abomination is. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. He's talking to you. He's not talking to you as in us. He's talking to these disciples. We read this as like, when you see it, well, who's we? Well, dispensationalists will say, oh, it's not even Christians. It's talking to Jewish people. Because we're going to be out of here by the time this all happens, right? Oh, well, there's a problem with that. He's talking to them. Why would he say, why wouldn't he just say they will see this, or there will be this, or whatever? He's talking to them as if they're going to see this. And there's going to be most of them, I think, that he's talking to. Let me see. Is James in this group? I think James is maybe the only one who died before this. But they're going to the group he's talking to are going to see this happen. So we're going to talk about this ensign right here, because a lot of times we're just like, oh, Rome had this ensign, they used it for war and everything. No, it was a pagan thing, and you had to bow to it and worship the emperor if you were a Roman. So B.H. Carroll, he wrote an introduction to the English Bible. He said, Pilate. Now this is a little bit before AD 70. This happened in Jerusalem shortly before. And what's going to happen is that these Roman soldiers are going to come into the area of Jerusalem, having these ensigns with them, and then bowing to it every morning. And then the Jews get upset. They're like, take this out of Judea, because this is not good. So he says, Pilate sent a legion of Roman soldiers and had them secretly introduced into the city and sheltered in the tower of Antonio overlooking the temple. And these soldiers brought with them their ensigns. The Roman sign was a straight staff capped with a metallic eagle, and right under the eagle was a graven image of Caesar. Caesar claimed to be divine. Caesar exacted divine worship, and every evening when those standards were placed, the Roman legion got down and worshiped the image of Caesar thereof. And every morning at the roll call, a part of the parade was for the whole legion to prostrate themselves before the graven image and worship it. The Jews were so horrified when they saw that image and the consequent worship, they went to Pilate and said, "Kill us if you will, but take that abomination of desolation out of our holy city and from the neighborhood of our holy temple." So I wanted to give this guy kind of like some credit here. I didn't know where to do it. David Curtis did a sermon on this, and I kind of looked through his notes and copied and pasted some of his sources. So I should give him some credit. Anyway, Saint Chrysostom, he says, Chrysostom lived what in the 2nd century, 3rd century. He's one of the church fathers. He said, "For this it seems to me that the abomination of desolation means the army by which the holy city of Jerusalem was made desolate." Saint Augustine said, "Luke, to show that what the abomination spoken of by Daniel will take place when Jerusalem is captured, recalls these words of the Lord in the same context. When you see Jerusalem compassed about with an army, then know that the desolation thereof is at hand," which is in Luke 21:20. For Luke very clearly bears witness that the prophecy of Daniel was fulfilled when Jerusalem was overthrown. The reason Luke rewords it is because Luke is writing his gospel to Theophilus, who is a Gentile, and isn't going to know what the abomination of desolation is because he's not familiar with Daniel. So he's kind of like he's writing it in a way that Theophilus could understand, but he transliterates it and he says, no, when you see it surrounded by armies, and like I said, in Jerusalem, the Christians knew when things started heating up and they saw the Roman soldiers and the ensigns, they got out of there and the Christians were all saved. C.H. Spurgeon is a Baptist minister. He's very influential. Spurgeon's a big name. He says, "This portion of our Savior's words appear to relate solely to the destruction of Jerusalem. As soon as Christ's disciples saw the abomination of desolation, that is the Roman ensigns with their idolatries, quote, stand in the holy place, they knew that the time for their escape had arrived, and they did flee to the mountains."
So the ensigns, you're saying they're more on the stamp, they're more than just
they're more than just like a war thing that you carry. Yeah, it's like it was like apparently a thing that you were supposed to bow down and worship Caesar and everything, because Caesar was considered to be a god, so it's talk about something that resembles like what we think of in Antichrist, right?
I wonder if they literally thought of Caesar as a god, or they kind of figured like.
Yeah, I mean they even had blasphemous names, it's not just Antiochus Epiphanes, but they were saying the son of God this, and if you translate the names of some of their emperors and the emperor worship that happened especially after AD 70, it was they were totally blasphemous names, the what they called themselves and the titles that they gave themselves was ridiculous. Philip Schaff, he writes, and I'm going to kind of end with Schaff's portion here, but he wrote History of the Christian Church. This is kind of like to kind of give you a picture of what it was like when the temple got burnt and everything. It says Titus, according to Josephus, intended at first to save the magnificent work of architecture, that is the temple, as a trophy of victory. In other words, he was like, he didn't want the soldiers were in the process of burning it down, but he didn't want it burnt down because he wanted it as a trophy, or maybe he had some superstitions about it. I don't know. And perhaps from some superstitious fear, and when the flames threatened to reach the Holy of Holies, he forced his way through flame and smoke over the dead and dying to arrest the fire. but the destruction was determined by a higher decree. I like that sentence. The destruction was determined by a higher decree. In other words, no, God had decreed this. To his own soldiers, roused to madness by the stubborn resistance and greedy of the golden treasuries, could not be restrained from the work of their destruction. In fact, Josephus says that it was worse trying to argue with the soldiers than with the flames themselves, because they just didn't even listen to Titus. They were so intent on burning this thing down.
Oh, the Romans.
Yeah,
Now,
the soldiers.
veil's already been torn, huh? I wonder what they.
Yeah, they were like when Titus showed up on the scene, because he was kind of newer to the scene, because it was his dad who had become emperor, Vespasian. He was sent there, and when he came into Jerusalem and saw what had been done there, he was kind of aghast at what what the Roman soldiers had done, because it was all of these kids, and it was just a bunch of civilians, unarmed people, just and just the nasty slaughter and starvation and ugly things that had gone on there, you know. At first, the halls around the temple were set on fire. Then a firebrand was hurled through the golden gate. When the flames arose, the Jews raised a hideous yell and tried to put out the fire, while others, clinging with a last convulsive grasp to their messianic hopes, rested in the declaration of a false prophet that God, in the midst of the conflagration of the temple, would give a signal for the deliverance of his people. So they had there was a rebel group that had kind of like caused this fight with the Romans, that had set this whole thing off like several years ago. And they believed from Daniel, they misinterpreted Daniel, and they believed that God was going to give them victory in fighting the Romans. So when you talk about like Simon the Zealot, you know, like it was probably the same guys. They actually became more and more popular, but they took over the temple, and they were there to fight the Romans, and so they had these messianic hopes. Well, their Messiah had just been there, but they're still looking for a Messiah, because they know from Daniel all of this is supposed to happen. But the way they're interpreting it is that they're going to be victorious, that their military leader is going to show up, right? So, and by the way, there's a ton of people in there. What had happened was that the Roman soldiers, there was going to be the what do you call it, the Passover. So you had all these pilgrims and tourists from all over the place, and the soldiers just let them in. Oh yeah, go ahead, it's cool, you know. And so they thought, well, I guess it's okay to go into the city. Well, what they did is they let a whole bunch of people into the city, knowing that they were going to trap them inside the city, and that those people would end up using up a lot more food and resources and water, which would cause starvation within the city more quickly. So there were, I think, about 800,000, between 600,000, 800,000 that were killed in this within Jerusalem. So the legions vied with each other in feeding the flames, and made the unhappy people feel the full force of their unchained rage. Soon the whole prodigious structure was in a blaze and illuminated the skies. It was burned on the 10th of August, AD 70, the same day of the year on which, according to tradition, the first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So yeah, so it's the same day that the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, hundreds of years, 600 years before. And now it's happening on the same day by the Romans. No one, says Josephus, could conceive a louder, more terrible shriek than arose from all sides during the burning of the temple. The shout of the victory and the jubilee of the legions sounded through the wailing of the people, now surrounded with fire and sword upon the mountain and throughout the city. The echo from all the mountains around, even to Perea, increased the deafening roar. Yet the misery itself was more terrible than the disorder. The hill on which the temple stood was seething hot, and seemed enveloped to its base in one sheet of flame. The blood was larger in quantity than the fire, and those who were slain were more in number than those that slew them. The ground was nowhere visible. All was covered with corpses. Over these heaps, the soldiers pursued the fugitives. The Romans planted their eagles on the shapeless ruins over against the eastern gate, offered their sacrifices to them, and proclaimed Titus imperator with the greatest acclamations of joy. Thus was fulfilled the prophecy concerning the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. And it reminds me of a couple of verses. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. You know, and then also in Daniel, it says on the wing of, yeah, right. See, it gets translated into vultures in some translations because they're like, well, eagles are not like, they're not like scavengers.
I heard that recently that the real word is eagle, vultures, because oh no, that's a different place where God says lift up on wings like eagles.
Right.
But it's really vultures because vultures actually soar higher.
Yeah.
The drafts.
But in this place, it's the eagles, and sometimes it's translated into vultures because people think, well, that doesn't really make sense. It would be where the vultures would gather around corpses, right? But why did Jesus use the word eagles? You know, so if we think about the ensigns, it kind of gives you a visual that like where the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate. So there you have that wing language there in Daniel 9:27. And that's it, you guys. We'll see where we go.
So what are you gonna what's a recap? Like,
a recap really is that when we're talking about the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple because he was the one who brought it up, and that's what the disciples are asking him about, you know. And so when you think, well, the abomination of desolation, wait, we're talking about that, but that's in the future, right? No, it's not in the future. I mean, there could be an abomination that causes desolation, but there's no reason to think that the old covenant is going to be reestablished. And you know, if there's a new temple sometime in Jerusalem, it's going to have nothing to do with God establishing it. You know, I couldn't imagine why. You know,
that covenant's over anyway.
Yeah, God was also, even when David wanted to make a temple for God, God was, I don't live in a house made by human hands. You know, there was a little bit of a pushback from the Lord. You know, I think the tabernacle, you know, Hebrews says the tabernacle was made to replicate what Moses had seen when he was on the mountaintop. And so there is, in Revelation, you see that there is a heavenly temple or a heavenly, but the things that are done there, the sacrifice that's there is not cattle, it's Christ's blood that's being presented. And his work is final. Jesus died once for all. And Hebrews keeps warning people, don't go back, don't go back. And we think in our minds, oh, don't go back into the life of sin, right? It's not what Hebrews is talking about, because it's addressing good Jewish people, you know, people who were convert. Well, they had accepted the new covenant. He's like, don't go back to the old covenant things. That's what he's saying. Don't go back to, you know, because what Jesus did is final, and it's better. And these things that we've always practiced are just, they were signifiers. They were symbolic of the things that what Christ would ultimately do. Now that the real thing has come, why would you go back to the symbolic practices? And so, and he says in Hebrews, you know, the writer is saying these things are coming to an end. He says every day the priests offer sacrifices, and they're doing this and they're doing this because it was still going on. But he says this is all coming to an end. The writer of Hebrews knew that the days of those practices were numbered, because every Christian knew, if they'd been around for a little while, that, you know, their Savior had said, this temple is toast. Yeah. So yeah, that's it's to kind of clear up a little bit of like when you read that passage, and we'll get into a little bit more of that passage. I'm also planning on doing some, well, you'll see. So it's kind of where we're parked, but I thought that was enough for one night.
It's a lot different than what a lot of us have thought of.
Yeah, it is a lot different, and I almost feel bad, but on the other hand, if I'm looking at what Christians have historically understood in the then I don't feel so bad, because it's like it's really a minority of Christendom that has seen the Olivet discourses all being in the future. Now, there's parts of the discourse that definitely are being seen as future by a lot of Christians in the past, and even church fathers and stuff like that. So that's a little bit different.
So there is a part of it that you think is split for the.
I am going to go ahead and present the whole thing from a preterist point of view, just so that you can weigh it. What I'm thoroughly convinced of is that the abomination causes desolation is about Daniel 9, and there's no reason to put that in the future.
What is a preterist?
Preterist just means that like you believe this prophecy's been fulfilled. So preterists, I mean, hardcore preterists see like all prophecies as already being fulfilled. I do not agree with that.
Yeah, that's
most people are that are preterists are like partial preterists, but there's some problems with that system. And well, depending on like what you want to do with it, and the way that I would treat Revelation, a lot of things I'm preterist about in Revelation, but Revelation is on a whole other level. There's a whole other dimension to it. You can't. It's really dangerous to just, not dangerous, but it's just.
Yeah, why is it just
the thing with Revelation is that there's 400 references to the Old Testament in Revelation. When you look at those references in the Old Testament, one will be about a prophecy about one thing, one will be a prophecy about another thing, one will be about, so it's kind of like it's using imagery from prophecies and even stories like Moses and the early Genesis and everything, and it's giving you a big picture view of salvation history as a whole. It's not necessarily trying to say, and then this would happen, and then this would happen, and then this is going to happen. So if you're either a preterist or a futurist, like somebody who thinks all this in the future, then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, or a preterist would say, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, then you're kind of like on shaky ground, because the Revelation is talking about something much bigger than that. It's a lot harder to but when I look at for example, oh, you're welcome.
Does Revelation say anything about the abomination of desolation?
No, it doesn't say anything about the bomb. It talks about some of the, okay, so when you're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, I definitely see that in the harlot, the Mystery Babylon. Because what you find out from Mystery Babylon that she is the city where Christ was crucified, and that kills the prophets. And so you're like, this is definitely Jerusalem, or it definitely has something to do with Jerusalem, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what she's doing is she's sitting on a beast with 7 heads, and she's told those 7 heads are 7 hills and 7 kings, whatever. And if you looked on a Roman coin, you could see Rome was the city on 7 hills, right? And why is she presented as a harlot? Well, Jerusalem was presented as a harlot by a lot of the prophets. It's like the unfaithful wife, the harlot, you're the mother of prostitutes and all that kind of stuff. So it's just using the same language that's always been there. And it's kind of, and it's used in contradiction to the the pure bride, and the woman that you see in Revelation 12, clothed with the sun and all that. So it's kind of like the tale of two women, right? Faithful people of God versus the unfaithful people of God, who actually aren't, people of God. And if you look at the things that she's wearing a bunch of the colors the priest would wear. So that, and then you have a bunch of things that she has, like chariots and all this kind of stuff, a list of things that's there that is also the things that Solomon collected for himself, things that God told him that he shouldn't collect. So it's all this imagery about like how Israel's leaders and their priests and all that had been unfaithful to God, and now they were in league with Rome. In fact, when Jesus was crucified, they said, "We have no other king but Caesar." Should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar. And they colluded with the Roman government in order to get Christ crucified. And they did the same thing to the Christians. It wasn't the Romans at first that were just going after Christians. It was the Romans that were persecuting Christians on behalf of the Sanhedrin, or it would just be the Jews themselves that would do this. So in that prophecy that you see, in that image that John sees, she gets devoured by the dragon, because God has put it in their hearts to turn against the woman. And yeah, so that's what happened in AD 70. So a lot of that imagery that you see with the harlot riding that beast, which I think is largely indicative of Rome, is the image of her kind of being in league with Rome, unfaithful to God, killing Christ and killing his prophets and the ones his apostles. And now she is going to be devoured by the dragon that she's sitting on. So
why it says she's sitting on it.
Because she's sitting on it because she is in league. She to a degree was in league with Rome. So that's kind of the picture there. Now, is that the entire thing that the harlot of Babylon is? I don't think so. I think there's kind of like imagery there that you could take into the future and something that like people could see later on with the papacy, or there's something about Revelation which is so general at the same time that you can read it and in any generation, and it's going to pertain to you and your generation. You're going to see pattern, because patterns like this unfold all the time. They say history repeats itself. It may never repeat itself, but it always rhymes. So there's going to be there have been countless times throughout history where people have read Revelation and go, "We're living in that time right now." And I think it's a natural thing to feel that, and you're right to a degree, but you can't just like pigeonhole it and say. So maybe sometime I'll talk about the four views on Revelation. There's basically four views on Revelation. So, well, one of them is that it's all in the future.
Yeah.
One of them is that it's all in the past and all was had to do that. It all happened in the first century. Another one is a historicist view, which sees, well, this is talking about the rise of Islam. This is talking about the rise of the papacy. This is about the discovery of the New World in America. It can be about all kinds of stuff. That's what that's
the
historicist view, right? And then you have a view called the idealist view. And the idealist view is that it's written in a way to send a message to every Christian living in every era, and that we should read it this way. So I think probably my perspective on it is kind of preterist in a lot of parts, but also idealist. There's a lot of people who are like idealists, but they do see things that happened in there, and they're like, this is about this, but it's being spoken of in a way that's representative of a much bigger picture. So it's it's one of those things that starts making sense the more you've been uh steeped in Old Testament prophetic language and stuff like that. But it's difficult. It's a difficult book. Yeah. Difficult book to talk about.
It just seems like to me after all this, that there's no prophecy left after 70 AD or very little, and there's been a long time period going on.
Yeah.
That's a whole
That's
nother
kind of
conversation, probably.
no. I think that here's where I sharply disagree with preterists, okay, or some preterists, I should say. That they will take it to such a degree that it's been fulfilled in such a way that there is no second coming of Christ.
Oh,
Right. Which I'm like, no, that isn't a Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is like, and he will come again and judge the righteous and the, that is something that is
well,
like,
they just throw all
that
out.
is something that to me is so basic to our Christianity that Christ is going to. So that's why I've said, we're living in that time where Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father, ruling with a rod of iron in the midst of his enemies until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And the last one to be put under his feet is death itself. And when that happens, everybody's going to come to life and he's going to judge everybody. So that's kind of that is my eschatology, and it's not that complex, It's just I don't think, like, well, then you're going to see, then there's going to be 7 years of this and a rapture here, and it all gets so tangled up and weird. But everything that Jesus says about the judgment is said in a way that tells you that the judgment of the righteous and the dead are at the same time and the same event. The wheat and the tares. Should we pull up the wheat, or should we pull out the weeds? No, leave them and let them grow together. At the end of the age, we'll gather them all together. I'll separate the weeds over here and the tares over here. Gonna burn up the weeds with fire, and gather the wheat into my barn. They ask him, what's this mean? He's like, at the end of the age, the angels will gather up everybody, and they're going to be judged. In other words, they're being judged at the same time. In fact, in that parable, the wheat are burned up before the tares. So my question is like, well, how can you have like one resurrection, which happens at secret rapture, another resurrection at the end of the 7-year tribulation, then a separate one at the end of 1,000 years after that. It's not the picture that Christ himself ever talks about. That's why it's difficult to talk about Revelation, because you have that millennium thing, which needs to be addressed. But that was part of the reason why Revelation took forever to get the stamp of approval. They didn't know if it was the church didn't know what to do with Revelation for a long time. It wasn't accepted in the West until the 5th century, and it wasn't accepted in the East till the 6th century. And one of the reasons that it wasn't accepted was because people were taking Revelation and started a doctrine called Chiliasm from it. And Chiliasm basically means that that there would be 1,000-year reign of Christ after his return. And the church was like, we don't believe that. So and it wasn't that it was considered such a bad heresy, it's that there was a group called the Montanists who were also Chiliasts, and that didn't help the reputation. So what happened, there was one church father who had done a commentary on Revelation early on, and it included a Chiliast perspective when it got to the millennium. The church did not want to. They thought Revelation is just going to be too easily misunderstood. Plus, they had some questions about authorship. What happened in the west was that in the 5th century, Jerome got a hold of that commentary. He kind of plagiarized it. All he did was change the chiasm stuff into, like, and then add his own commentary about, like, this is not 1,000 years in the future, did something else with it. And then it got accepted in the West. And then 100 years after that, there was a guy named Andrew of Caesarea in the East who did the same thing, basically took that commentary and changed the chiasm part. But that's to say that, like, neither the church in the East nor the West accepted a view of a millennial reign of Christ afterwards. I don't think it's a heresy or anything like that, but that was a hang up for the church back then. So for 500 years, so.
Yep.
Anyway, we went again down a couple of rabbit holes.
I know, I keep wanting to ask the questions, I'll ask you after you stop recording. We'll just keep going.
Yeah, I'll have like another hour and a half. People look at these videos and go, I'll listen to some that's 2 hours long. Anyway, you guys got any questions, comments, or anything?
I got a lot to think about.
It is a lot to think about, I think.
Thank you, Mark. That's
Too hard.
Hey, you're welcome, you guys. You guys
Thank
be
you very
blessed.
much.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. All right, see you guys
We'll
later.
do later.
All right, bye-bye.
Hope you feel better.
Yeah.
I don't
Always
feel
feel
too bad,
better.
but thank you. All right,
Mhm.
see ya.
See you guys.
Ciao.